Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to the fifth installment of the History of the English Language, She2. All right, so we're going to be dealing with external influences on the history of English, external influences on the history of English. We're focusing today on the transition from Old English to Middle English, starting with the influence of Celtic, talking a bit also about the influence of Latin and the influence of Norse. Next time, when we get onto the Middle English section, we will be dealing with the influence of French and Anglo-Norman, which is the early variety of French introduced after the Norman conquest. Of course, there were internally motivated changes too. What I'm telling you today is only part of the story, but I think it's good to try and bring these contact situations together and focus on them together so that we can compare them, see what kind of contact influence arose from each of these types of situation. And here we're going to take the semi-arbitrary cut-off point of 1150, aka the end of the Old English period. So these are changes, all of the changes we're discussing today are externally motivated changes, or changes that have been claimed to be externally motivated before the point of 1150. I see we already have a question, yes. Okay, so it turns out that the lecture is on Ilias. It's just right at the bottom. So somewhere, hopefully you should be able to find it if you need it. One of the big questions, of course, is what happened to all of the endings? We spent quite a lot of the last two lectures going through all of these morphological paradigms that we find in the history of English, in the pre-Old English, in the pre-Old English period, in the Old English period itself. And what we then find is that they all go, they all disappear. Obviously, they're not there today. Almost all of these endings have been lost. So obviously, we want to know what happened to them. And here, it might be relevant that English is basically the only Germanic language to have undergone this level of inflectional loss. German still has most of these inflections. Icelandic still has pretty much all of them. Dutch and the mainland Scandinavian languages have lost quite a lot of endings, but have not lost arguably quite as many of them as English has. So where do they all go? Obviously, one thing to look for here, one aspect that we can look at, is the external history of the language. What languages was English in contact with? What languages, more accurately, it's always, I think, better to think about it in these terms, what languages were the speakers of Old English in contact with? What languages were spoken by the people who the speakers of Old English were in contact with? That might seem like a terminological distinction, but I think it's actually more important because it's a lot easier to concretize, to think about a situation concretely if you think about actual people in actual communicative situations, in situations of language learning, in situations of trade, in situations of travel and interaction of all kinds, because that is where language contact happens. We don't have abstract, floaty objects, English and French, that kind of float around the place, bumping into each other. Those things don't exist. What does exist is people and the languages they have in their heads and the languages that come out of their mouths, and those are the things that determine what happens in a given language contact situation, as we'll see. Just one practical note before we go on. Next week, there will not be a lecture because it is the Vertiefungswoche, the consolidation week. So no meeting next week. The week after that, so that's the 3rd of June, there will be another video lecture as we did for the prehistory of Old English. So again, the week after that, no need to come here. The material will be covered in a series of little videos that you can find on Ilias, because I'm away that week. The week after that, it is some holiday or other. I can't remember which one. Pfingst. Okay, Pfingsten. So that's why. So again, there won't be a lecture next week, which means that the next time you'll see me is in 4 weeks' time. In fact, 4 weeks from today, which is quite a long time. So try and make sure in that time that you do not forget absolutely everything that you have learned about the English language. Keep attending the tutorials in the weeks where there are lectures, and maybe even open the textbook and have a look at that too. That won't kill you. We can move on now, unless there are any practical questions about that. I'm sorry it's worked out like this, that we've got this big gap in the middle of the semester, but unfortunately it was unavoidable. Okay, so this is something that you've seen before. This is a slide that I flashed up in one of the earliest lectures, and this is a timeline of the kind of languages, the precise languages that were in contact with English and when. So you can see from this timeline, Latin has pretty much always been in contact with English, even before there was an English. So the dividing line in roughly 449 between pre-English, Germanic, West Germanic, and English after 449, Latin was in contact before that. From the point that the speakers of a Germanic language arrived in the British Isles, they were also in contact with Celtic. And one of the places that they would have arrived is Dover, which is still a place that people very commonly arrive when they're getting to the UK by sea. And Dover, in fact, has a Celtic name, a name that comes from Celtic, as do many places in the UK. After that, we have a contact situation with Scandinavian or Norse from roughly the beginning of the 9th century, 800, until, well, we're not exactly sure, but probably until around 1250 at least. We've got French after the Norman conquest, and Latin again, because Latin was the scribal language of the Normans as well as Anglo-Norman itself. Later on, from the Renaissance onwards, we find Greek having quite a major influence. A lot of the Greek influence is via Latin, but we don't see, we don't, of course, see it before that. And then, ever since England has been going around conquering and attacking other countries, which is something that it has historically been very keen to do, we have had influence from the languages of those places, and lexical influence in particular. And of course, also new varieties of English have arisen in those areas. We haven't got to that stage yet, and we won't for a few weeks, but I will be telling you a little bit more about those later on. And of course, who knows what's happening right now? All kinds of things. English is in contact with many languages around the globe. Or, like I said, better to put it in another way, English speakers are in contact with speakers of other languages all around the globe, every day in all kinds of little situations, including right here in this room right now. We're still part of the history of English. Now, of course, if you take a slide like this, it's oversimplifying on a number of levels. So one thing is that for each of these languages, I've mentioned one or two or three words that are borrowed from this language. But words are not all there is to languages, right? Languages would be really boring if they were just bags of words, or at least they would be boring to someone like me who devotes their life to studying them. Languages are more than that. Languages have syntax, morphology, phonology, etc. And all of those things can be influenced through language contact too. This slide does not represent that. Another thing this slide doesn't represent is the fact that some of these languages demonstrably had much more influence than others. And that's true on the level of lexical items, on the level of the vocabulary, but also on the level of syntax, morphology, phonology, etc. So this is just showing each of these as a box. And it's also a discrete box. This representation also doesn't tell us when the contact was at its strongest. And of course, it's also fallacious to assume that any language just suddenly dropped out of contact at a certain point. For Latin, for instance, there's a gap in the middle. But there wasn't really a gap because the Anglo-Saxons between 750 and 1066 still used Latin as a language very extensively, especially in a church setting and in an ecclesiastical setting. Similarly, although English may not be quite as heavily in contact with Norse, with the Scandinavian languages, as it was in the Middle Ages, it is still, to a certain extent, in contact with them, as you will see if you ever go to Scandinavia. And I would bet that the language that you use to communicate there would probably be English. So a timeline like this is a bit insufficient in many ways. It's not giving us all of the information we need. It doesn't tell us about anything other than lexical contact. It doesn't tell us anything about the scale of the contact. It doesn't tell us anything about the type of the contact. And it doesn't tell us anything really about when this contact sort of waxed and waned, when it started and when it finished, except in the most coarse possible terms. So we're going to need to dig into each of these contact situations in turn. We'll be starting with Celtic, moving on to talking about Latin, and then finally Norse at the end of today. And those are the three contact situations we will be dealing with. Celtic then. What sort of language are we talking about here? Celtic is not a language, at least not today. Celtic is a family of languages. And once upon a time, they were spoken all across West and Central Europe. The people who, if you go to the Archaeological State Museum down the road next to the Sternenplatz, you will see Celtic remains, Celtic bits and pieces, bits of Celtic culture. So this area, as well as most of the rest of West and Central Europe, was once inhabited by Celts who would have spoken a Celtic language, and that is quite important for the history of English, of course, because not only was there contact in the British Isles, there was also contact before that. There was contact between Germanic speakers and Celtic speakers pre-449, when the people who were going to become the Anglo-Saxons were still on the continent. Archaeologically, we can associate the Celts with the Hallstatt culture and the Latin culture. These days, the languages of the Celts are only spoken in the far western areas of the British Isles. So we've got a map. You can see here the languages in question. They're all in varying degrees of healthiness. If we think of these languages in terms of the number of speakers they have and how fluent they are and who's speaking them, what we see is that Scottish Gaelic, for instance, is spoken over a relatively broad area. By no means all of Scotland, because Scotland starts down here. But this area in the north and in the west is the area where Scots Gaelic is still spoken, in the Highlands and these northwestern islands as well, like the Hebrides. There is Irish, which is spoken, again, not all across Ireland, not really. The places where it's really strongly spoken are, again, on the western side of the country. A lot of people in Ireland learn Irish in school, but they are not speaking it at home, they're not speaking it natively, they just get exposed to it in the school context, and rather than being something that they are proud of or something that they associate with, it's actually something quite annoying for them because they have to learn it in that specific context. So we've got Scottish Gaelic and Irish. These two are called the Goidelic Celtic languages, and then there are the Brythonic Celtic languages, Welsh and Breton. Welsh is spoken in Wales, again not in all of Wales, it's strongest in the northwest of Wales. Breton is spoken down here in France. Now the Breton speakers have an interesting history. Given that I earlier said that the Celts were all over Europe, you might expect that these Bretons are remnants of Celtic speakers from France, or what was then Gaul. They're actually not. And that's not to say that there weren't Celtic speakers in France. There were, the Gauls, and if you know Asterix and Obelix, these are Gauls. So those are Celtic. They would have been Celtic speakers. But that variety of Celtic died out, and we don't have much record of it. What we do have is Breton. And Breton actually came from Britain. So the speakers of Breton actually migrated, brought their language with them during the Anglo-Saxon period. They migrated essentially back, in inverted commas, to the continent. So that's the story there. The Breton language, insofar as it still exists, again, it's not hugely widely spoken in Brittany, but it is still spoken. It is a Celtic language, a Brythonic Celtic language, and it's spoken in the northwestern tip of France. There are two other languages that some people still think exist, if I can put it that way, Manx and Cornish. Both of these languages went through a period of extreme decline. They were very much, English became the dominant language in virtually all contexts. Now, both of these languages are undergoing revivals. So Cornish is down here, in this southwestern tip of Britain. This is the latest of all of the areas that came under Anglo-Saxon rule in the British Isles, in England. This was the latest one. It was actually at the very end of the Old English period that this area came under Anglo-Saxon rule. That may be one of the reasons why the language survived for so long. Like I said, there are still speakers today, there are still street signs if you go there today. It's a very interesting language with a very active language revitalization community trying to spread it. The same is true of Manx, which is spoken on this tiny island here, the Isle of Man. Manx is actually a Gaelic Celtic language, like Irish and Scots Gaelic. Very, very interesting place, all kinds of interesting language history there, but not something that we will be able to dwell on now. And all of the other Celtic languages are extinct. So there were Celtic speakers in Italy, there were Celtic speakers in France. We have records of what they were doing to a certain extent, limited records. There were Celtic speakers in Spain. There were also Celtic speakers here and all across Central Europe, but most of them haven't left as many records behind as the ones on this slide. So those are the Celtic languages today, and they were much more broadly spoken. What's important for our purposes is that before the Anglo-Saxons arrived in the British Isles, Celtic speakers were already there. And in fact, when the Anglo-Saxons arrived on the British Isles, Celtic speakers are the only speakers who we know to have been there. There may have been other languages there too, languages spoken before Celtic. But if there were, we know nothing about them. So the earliest languages, the languages that have the longest history on the British Isles that we know of are the Celtic languages. If you want to look at this from a genetic angle, you can look at Sykes, 2006, but there's a caveat there, which is you have to be careful with Sykes because the people he calls Celts are not the same people that I've been calling Celts. Sykes refers to a much earlier migration of people in the Neolithic, so they can't have been Celtic speakers. So coming on to what we actually know from archaeological evidence, Celtic speakers coexisted with Germanic speakers. And here, there is a very active literature. I've said before that the history of English is not a closed book. There is plenty that is still unknown about the history of English, not only because part of it is still being written, but also because there are a lot of things that we haven't understood very well, or that we thought we understood until recently, but recently we realized we actually don't. And one of those things is Celtic influence. So in the 19th century, there was a very widespread view that essentially there was no Celtic influence, and there was no Celtic influence because the Celts just were a bit rubbish. Right? As people, they were inferior to the Anglo-Saxons, so the Anglo-Saxons just got rid of them all, or enslaved them all, or both, or drove them away, and therefore, because they were the inferior people, they didn't leave any mark on the culture. or in the language, because for the Victorians, language was really a part of culture. Now, in the 21st century, we know that basically talking about inferior and superior peoples in the first place is a load of old nonsense. So we don't do that. And we also know that language contact is a lot more complicated than people previously thought. Language contact is not just people borrowing words because a certain language is prestigious or more powerful. Languages that are less prestigious, that doesn't mean inferior, just less popular. Languages that are less prestigious can also have a major linguistic influence on the languages that are more prestigious through various ways. Still, there's a lot that we don't really know about this language contact situation because it was such a long time ago. What we don't find is any particular archaeological evidence that the Saxons, that the Anglo-Saxons just went and killed a lot of Celts. We read in the texts about battles, but we don't find any sort of mass graves of the kind that we would expect from large-scale military engagements. And in fact, where we do find cemeteries, they suggest peaceful burial practices, and they suggest that the two peoples were mixing. So they suggest that there were Celts and Anglo-Saxons being buried or being cremated together as part of the same communities. There's also very interesting evidence from the word welch, which means various things, which means it can mean a foreigner, it can mean a slave, and it can mean a Briton. It means all of these things in Old English. Refers essentially to Celtic speakers, because those were the people who the Anglo-Saxons perceived as foreigners, those were the people who the Anglo-Saxons took as slaves, and they were the Britons. Place names also contain this element. Interestingly, this word, welch, is related to the German word Welsch, as in Rotwelsch or Kauderwelsch. Right? It's the same Welsch. Right? It's some sort of foreign weirdness, basically, is the general connotation that it seems to have retained to this day. And the way this word is used suggests certain ideas, suggests certain hypotheses about the structure of the contact, about the nature of the contact situation. It suggests a situation of slavery for a start. So it could quite well have been the case that there was a sort of two-class system in the Anglo-Saxon period. This has been described in terms of apartheid, as in like South African apartheid. It's also been described as a more, maybe a less segregated on the societal level, but still a deeply unequal society, which you might compare to early America with regard to African slaves. We don't know much about the situation, but that's one plausible way of interpreting the evidence that we do have. So in terms of Celtic influence on English then, what do we see? We can divide them into three phases. The first phase is loans into West Germanic. So this is before English. Before there was any English, there are certain words which can be assumed to be borrowed from Celtic on the continent, and other West Germanic languages borrow these words too. So dun, for instance, meaning a hill, beak, so the beak of a bird, this is a word that also is assumed to be borrowed from Celtic. Car, interestingly, car is assumed to be borrowed from Celtic, and that's not because the Celts had cars in the 4th century AD, but they did have something similar, which was chariots. And you can, if you want to look at the archaeological evidence, there are some beautiful images of the kind of thing that we see. So here, this is a piece of Celtic art found in the German-speaking area, the Strettweg Kultwagen, and you can see that these people had a little chariot with little wheels on it. And that is pretty cool. And the Germanic speakers probably also thought that it was pretty cool because they borrowed the word. We're not 100% sure, and one thing that might have happened here is that the word might have been borrowed through Latin rather than directly into West Germanic. So it might have been the Latin speakers that borrowed the word car, and then the Germanic speakers borrowed it in turn from them. In phase 2, these are all of the loans that happened in the British Isles, but before 1400. And in phase 3, is everything else. So all of the loans that happen after 1400. We won't be talking about this later phase because it's beyond the time period that we're interested in for now. Also, when you look at these words, most of them are not hugely widespread. So most of us don't spend too much of our time these days talking about bards. Also, leprechauns. Very important. They're the little dudes with hats that sit at the end of the rainbow and sit on a pot of gold, but they're not crucial to modern day society, I would claim. And then a few other words as well. Some of them are more common. Bog, clan, whiskey. That is a word that's extremely important to modern society. But we're not going to look any further at these words today. Coming back to phase 1 then, as I've said, so carus and lancia were probably borrowed from Celtic into Latin in the first instance, and probably went into West Germanic through Latin. As for beak, this is our third word, this comes from Celtic, but actually not via Latin, but rather via French. So this is a language that actually French borrows from probably the Gaulish language of Asterix and Obelix. And this word survived in French, and then when the Normans came to the British Isles, they brought this word with them. So this is a later borrowing, and as for dun, meaning hill, this again may well be a borrowing from Celtic into Germanic. And there are names. So one name that you'll probably all be fairly familiar with is the Rhine. So both in German and in English we have this word, Rhein, Rhine, and this river name comes from Celtic originally. At least that's the mainstream theory. River names are notoriously weird and hard to pin down, but usually they are very, very old. So they often tell us intriguing but confusing things about the earliest stages of languages. The Danube also has a name that is probably originally Celtic. And finally, cognac, another thing that is extremely important in modern society. As for phase 2 then, here, these are the languages that are spoken. This is the contact phase from when the Anglo-Saxons arrived in the British Isles to 1400, the middle of the Middle English period. And here the crucial language is Brythonic Celtic. So this is the ancestor of Welsh, Cornish, and Breton. And here, the main thing that we see is that place names are borrowed into English. So, for instance, the River Avon, as in Stratford-upon-Avon, where Shakespeare is from, if there even was such a person as Shakespeare. Don't let me hear the literature people shouldn't listen to me saying that, but who knows. The River Avon, interestingly, in Celtic, it comes from the word avon in Celtic, which just means river. So when we talk about the River Avon, we're really talking about the river. Similarly, the place name Dover, this just comes from a word dur, meaning water. So this place, which is next to the water, is just called water. So place names sometimes have interesting names, and obviously these place names would not have been transparent to later speakers. So just as we now don't know, unless we know some Celtic, that Avon just means river in Proto-Brythonic, all of these words would have been intransparent even to the early Anglo-Saxons unless they themselves knew some Celtic, which most of them probably didn't. Other place names that come from Celtic are some pretty important places: Cardiff, capital of Wales; Belfast, de facto capital of Northern Ireland; Kent, the county of Kent; the Thames, that is the river that runs through Oxford and London; Wight, as in the Isle of Wight, that also comes from Celtic; and finally London, the capital. Again, a Celtic word, borrowed into Latin as Londinium, and retained from then onwards. We also have some landscape terms, so some that you might be familiar with or might not. Cairn. A cairn is like a pile of rocks that is used as a way marker, or sometimes you find them on top of hills. A glen, that's more or less just like a nice sort of park type place that's in the wild. You generally find them in Scotland these days. A loch, also found in Scotland, is not a hole, or it is a hole, it's a kind of hole, but it's full of water, and it's in Scotland. So Loch Ness, for instance, where you find the Loch Ness Monster. Or more often where you don't find the Loch Ness Monster, but you can try to find it. Dolmen, a dolmen is again a word for a big standing stone. So these are not hugely common words across the English-speaking world. Coombe, meaning valley, is another word, though again it's not a productively used word today. You might wonder, and this is a valid concern, why the lexical influence from Celtic is so limited. Why, given that these Celts would have been the vast majority of the population at the earliest stage, so the Anglo-Saxons, when they arrived, would have been a tiny minority, why did these Celts have so little influence on the vocabulary? And this probably does have to do with prestige, because the thing that we can attribute safely to Celtic is low social status. If these Celts were slaves, or if they were part of a sort of separate but less prestigious community, then it's quite clear that these peoples that there's no reason to borrow words from them unless it's a word for something specific that you need to refer to. And that might be the case for specific features, landscape features, for instance, like lochs and glens, and place names. As well as Brythonic influence, there is also influence from Gaelic, and that is via Irish. So as in the process of Christianization of northern England, there were two main streams of influence. So if we go back to the map briefly, there was influence coming from the continent. So there was a push towards Christianization from missionaries sent by Pope Gregory, Augustine's mission from 597 onwards to Christianize the Anglo-Saxons. Because remember, when the Anglo-Saxons first arrived in the British Isles, they were pagans. But there was also a Christianization effort from Ireland. And so this link here between Ireland and England was actually quite important in terms of the Christianization of early England. And these Irish missionaries, people would have come over to the British Isles and what do they do, missionary? They proselytize, that's the word. They do their missionary thing, and they bring words with them. And they bring words like dru, which is a druid or a magician, and drucraft, so druidcraft, wizardry, magic. because, of course, these are Christians, this drugkraft is usually viewed in a very negative context, right? These are the bad guys. These are the non-Christians. But the word itself clearly comes from Irish. It has to come from Irish. Okay, and that's 7th century influence, so it's very early influence. Interestingly, also, the Celtic missionaries were not just active in the British Isles, they were also active on the continent. Some of them made their way as far as here, or at least Reichenau and St. Gallen. There was a very strong connection between the monastery of St. Gallen, for instance, just across the lake, and the Irish monasteries and the Irish religious orders. And that can be seen in the type of art, the type of illuminated book that can be found in the beautiful library of St. Gallen. If you haven't been, it's very much worth a visit. Okay, but on the whole, the lexical influence of Celtic was limited, as we would expect from a language of low prestige. On the other hand, it's quite likely that there were other kinds of influence from Celtic in the history of English, specifically syntactic influence. We find prepositions used to express an ongoing action. So in very early, in Old English texts even, we find phrases like, I am on hunting, meaning I am hunting, I'm in the process of hunting. This is quite a lot, actually, like German, ich bin am Essen, or something like that, where you've got an am. So that might be a cause, in fact, to doubt of Celtic influence here, given that it's something that we also find in German. We find a progressive ending. So the ing progressive ending is something that we don't really see. We don't see the specific ending in Old English, at least not used like this. But it does crop up in the Middle English period, and then we find it very, very productively. And it goes, basically, the progressive is one of the great success stories of the English language. It's constantly being extended to new environments. You might be familiar with the early noughties McDonald's slogan, I'm loving it, which people really disliked because love is a stative verb, and for some people, it's not compatible with a progressive. So you would have to say, I love it. But McDonald's said, I'm loving it instead. And that kind of usage is, as far as we can tell, spreading. The dummy do that we have in English, so this is do as in negative sentences, I didn't see him. Do as in interrogative sentences, questions like, did you see him? And also ellipsis sentences like, I haven't seen him, but John did. Right? Where this did is referring, it means did see him. This do is something that's quite weird about English, and that the other Germanic languages don't have, at least not in this level of productivity. And again, it has been claimed that this is due to Celtic influence. Finally, cleft sentences. So if you say something like, it is Celtic that she is learning. Now, you can say things like this in German, but they're just quite awkward. And English does this an awful lot. English uses a great deal of these sentences, these cleft sentences. It is X that Y. This is basically how we do, one of the main ways of doing focus in English. We use these cleft sentences. And here too, Celtic influence has been proposed. But in all of these cases, the Celtic influence is debated. There's a big debate going on at the moment about where exactly the Celtic influence really was in the history of English. Which of these cases are real cases of language contact? What's somewhat mysterious is that some of these changes are only seen in the Middle English phase. So the dummy do, for instance, only arises really from about 1400 onwards, which is arguably, you would expect it to show up earlier. There are various reasons that it might not, but that's a whole debate that I can't go into today. And if you do want to go into that debate, then in future you can take my She 3 class, Anglo-Saxons, Celts and Vikings, the next time I offer it. So there's a plug for that. All right, any questions about the Celtic influence? Okay, so Latin influence. I've talked for longer about the Celtic influence because it's the most interesting, it's the most debated. But it's probably, in the grand scheme of things, not the largest influence, depending on how you count. So let's talk about Latin now. So Latin, you should hopefully at least all know what it is. It's an Indo-European language, just like all of the others we're discussing today. Specifically, it belongs to the Italic branch, along with some little-known languages now extinct, Oscan and Umbrian. It is indirectly the mother language of all of the Romance languages spoken today. The first evidence we have of Latin is really, really old. We've got Latin from 2,500 years ago. We do not have English from 2,500 years ago. I wish. We have English from a maximum of about 1,500 years ago, and even then it's only inscriptions. So we've got lots of evidence for Latin. And Latin, of course, spread as the political influence of the Roman Empire spread. So Latin was something that was extremely prevalent in the period before the Anglo-Saxons arrived in the British Isles. Obviously, what the people would have been speaking in the British Isles and in other areas, in France, even in Italy itself, would not have been the sort of book Latin that we're familiar with. It would have been some kind of colloquial Latin, some kind of Umgangssprache, and we don't know all that much about the details of that. But if you're interested in the prehistory of Latin, then you should go to Georg Kaiser's History of Romance Languages lectures, because he knows a heck of a lot more about this than I do. In terms of contact with Germanic, once again, we can think of various different phases of contact, different stages of contact. So Latin was in contact with Germanic on the continent, just like Celtic was, and there are about 170 words, so a lot of words. Remember, we could only really find 4 for Celtic, but a lot of words come from Latin into Germanic, while Germanic is still spoken on the continent. So there would have been a type of Latin also spoken in Britain during and after the Roman occupation, because remember, Britain was under Roman rule for some of the periods preceding the Anglo-Saxon arrival, and there are over 100 words from this period too. And much, much later, during the Renaissance and beyond, we get many thousands of loans. So Latin is a really, really productive donor language. We get loads of words from Latin. And in a way, this is precisely the opposite situation from Celtic. Because Celtic, we're talking about a language of low prestige. But in the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries, you didn't get more high prestige than Latin. This was the language of the big political players. This was the language of history. This was the language of wisdom and knowledge and the church. And in many ways, it's still considered to be that today. So there are many, many of these loans, and there are early ones and there are late ones. Most importantly for us, loans came into English during the process of Christianization. So there was Irish influence in the 7th century. There was also influence from Latin. And here the story starts. Pope Gregory found some angles in the slave market in Rome. And there was some wordplay at this point, because angle sounds a bit like angel or engel. And so he says something like, oh, these guys look really angelic. Let us basically send a ton of missionaries and convert them all to Christianity. So that's what they did. They sent missionaries. The missionaries arrived in 597, and King Ethelbert of Kent welcomed them to the British Isles. This is documented in quite some detail in Bede's Historia and in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. And during this period, around 150 words is the usual estimate of words borrowed during this Christian period. So an interesting question at this point is, how can we tell whether a word is early as a loan or late? And the answer is, we can look at the sound changes that it has undergone. So remember that sound changes only happen in a particular place at a particular time. This is something I hinted at last week as well. So you can look and see whether a word contains breaking or fronting. And if you look at the word inche, Old English unce, from Latin uncia or uncia. This is a word that contains fronting of the first vowel. So an O, a back vowel, has turned into an U, a front vowel. That must have happened through the process of fronting that we were familiar with before. So fronting, you've got a little box here that reminds you what we saw 2 weeks ago. Fronting is where back or low vowels like U become fronted, front vowels like U produced at the front of the mouth, if there is an I or a Y in the following syllable. And here you can see that there is, at least historically there is. This would have been an I. As for false, we look at the word false, which turns into modern false. So we see false in Old English, and it comes from Latin falsus. Question is this an early loan or a late loan? Well, one thing that this word has is the environment for breaking. We would expect to see breaking here because we've got the right environment. We've got an A vowel, or we would have had an A vowel, which is followed by an L. So this would have been, if it was an early borrowing, it would have undergone breaking. It would have become feals with an air diphthong. The fact that it doesn't means that it must be a late loan. So we're using a type of negative evidence here, and we can see whether a word contains fronting or breaking. If it does, we can say that it's an early loan because it was borrowed before these sound changes happened. It was already in the English language, and therefore it was subject to the sound change like every other word. And if it doesn't contain these sound changes, it must be a later borrowing, a borrowing that happened after these sound changes took place in the 7th century. If in doubt, you can look these words up in the OED online. So you can find out. Most of them, of course, are late loans because the overwhelming majority of words in modern English are borrowed much, much later, after the Renaissance. But for Old English, it's probably about 50-50, early versus late. Interestingly, sometimes we don't just get a whole word borrowed directly. We have loan translations. So here, there's a Latin word unicornus, a unicorn. And literally what this means is uni, one, cornus, horn. So one horn. And that is translated into Old English as Einhorn, which might remind you of, I think, German Einhorn, potentially, which is exactly the same word. So English and German have both done exactly the same thing with this word, which is in the early stages, Old English, they both borrow the structure, right? So what you want to refer to is this thing here, some sort of horse with a big ice cream cone thing stuck on its head. And that is then, and they don't just borrow the word, they borrow the structure of the word, because what's special about this horse is that it's got one horn. And therefore, you want to translate it into your language as one horn. So we have Old English Einhorn, German Einhorn. And interestingly, of course, English later borrows the word unicorn. And it later borrows the word unicorn from Latin directly. So it's actually borrowed, in the first time round it borrowed the structure, one horn, and then it borrows the whole word. Similarly, the same thing is true for Trinity. Latin trinitas is borrowed into English as threeness, literally threeness, like the state of being three. And again, German does something very similar here. So you have Dreifältigkeit, right? Which is, again, sort of threefoldiness. So English, Old English and German behave the same here, surprise, surprise, in that you get loan translations. And again, the modern English word Trinity is borrowed into English directly from Latin. And it's borrowed directly from Latin much, much later. I think, again, this is a Renaissance period borrowing. Okay, as far as the fate of these loanwords is concerned, so what happens to them later, the early ones are usually phonologically adapted. So one thing that we see is that the stress shifts. Latin has the word candela, so de is the stressed syllable, the second syllable. This gets borrowed into Old English as candle. The stress shifts to the can syllable. And it does that because that is the Old English structure, right? Old English has first syllable stress, as we covered a few weeks back. And similarly, Latin cometa, a comet, this is adapted to Old English cometa. And they did know, interestingly, about things like comets in the Old English period. They had some astronomical knowledge during this time. Later loanwords on the whole, so after the Middle English periods, loanwords are much more rarely phonologically adapted. So usually loanwords are borrowed whole and they just stay the same. So English after the Middle English period doesn't do so much adaptation of its words. It just takes words much more liberally from left, right and centre. Sometimes though, we see the same word being borrowed twice. So, for instance, magister, Latin magister, is borrowed in Old English, and within Old English it becomes master. It becomes master through palatalization, because magister becomes magister. Magister becomes something like Meister, like in German, and then Meister becomes master through a process of monophthongization. So magister is the ancestor of master, but then, of course, what's interesting is that in the 15th century, the word magister is then re-borrowed into English. So then, after that, the Old English, after that, Middle English has the word magister again, and usually it's used for some sort of high official, a legal official. For instance, magistrate is the more common word in modern English. So the early domains then for these loanwords are commercial domain, religious domain, military domain, and cultural domain. This is a classic pattern for prestige-driven borrowing. There wasn't, as far as we can tell, any deep structural influence from Latin, nor would we expect there to be, because basically structural influence happens when there are actually native speakers around trying to speak another language. For instance, with Celtic, there were Celtic speakers in the British Isles speaking Old English. Were there Latin speakers in the British Isles speaking Old English? Probably never. Possibly at the very, very earliest stage to a very small extent, but overwhelmingly, Latin, throughout the history of English, has been a language of writing, a language of prestige, but not a language that was actually spoken or used in day-to-day communication by almost anyone. And that is probably why, that's the best explanation at least for why the Latin influence that we see is basically lexical influence. We don't see, for instance, deep morphological influence. We don't see any great phonological influence, at least arguably not, and we don't see any syntactic influence at all. So that's the influence of Latin. As you can see, it's almost the polar opposite of Celtic in terms of the type of language contact situation. And the important message here is that language contact is really not one size fits all. Language contact can be a variety of different situations with a variety of different outcomes. Are there any questions about the Latin influence scenario? So finally then we come to Norse, And Norse, when I talk about Norse, I'm using this term as a cover term for a range of Scandinavian languages, a range of languages that are North Germanic languages. Of all of the languages that we've spoken about today, these are the ones that are most closely related to English, historically speaking, because they're also Germanic languages. The history in a nutshell is that in the 8th century, we get people in present-day Norway, Denmark, and Sweden moving, settling, trading in other areas of Europe, including the British Isles. Not so much from Iceland at this stage, because Iceland wasn't settled in the early 8th century, according to most accounts. In the 9th century, these Scandinavians start to settle in the east of England. So the early contacts between the Scandinavians and the Anglo-Saxons would have been, to a certain extent, military conflict, so Viking raids on the eastern and northern coasts of the British Isles in particular, but also trade contact. In the 9th century, that changes, because what we see in the 9th century, particularly from 865 onwards, is that the Danes start to settle in the east of England. So Eastern England suddenly becomes a place where Danish speakers are living. And they bring their families, they bring their relatives, they bring their friends. They're moving over there in bulk. This is a serious operation. These Scandinavians are there to stay. And in the 10th century, we find Norwegians settling in the northwest of England. Something that's often forgotten is that in the early 11th century, the UK was completely under Scandinavian control, under Knut the Great, one of the few English kings to ever bear the name the Great, other than Alfred. So we've got all of this influence, Danish, Norwegian. This isn't just some sort of abstract, those people over there. This is the Scandinavians, the Danes, the Norwegians that are settling in the British Isles. And obviously, that is precisely the kind of scenario that we would expect to lead to quite a dramatic level of language contact. So, do we find that? The first challenge that we face here is that Anglo-Norse is actually not attested except in the form of inscriptions. Although we know it's more closely related to Old English, we don't know exactly what it would look like, and we can't know that because we simply don't have any records. Our early records of Scandinavian in general are very, very limited. We have records from Iceland, from Norway, from Sweden, but they're mostly much later. And these later records from the mainland and from Iceland may not represent the type of Scandinavian language that was being used in England during the relevant period. We do know that it was similar, and we also know that these languages had many words completely in common. So many of these words would have been just exactly the same word in Scandinavian and in English, solely because these are directly related languages with a historical common origin of no more than about 800 years in the past. So we have words like man, wife, folk, winter, summer, that would have already, before language contact, been exactly the same word in these two languages. And Townend, in a book from 2002, which is worth taking a look at if you're interested in these issues, he's argued that these two languages, Norse and Old English, were actually to some extent mutually intelligible. To some extent, these were people could speak Norse and be understood by Old English speakers, and Old English speakers could speak Old English and be understood by Norse speakers. So that makes this quite a radically different kind of situation from the one that we see with Celtic or Latin. In any case, contact affected both the lexicon and the grammatical system of English, and depending on how you count, some people are more skeptical, some people are less skeptical, but depending on how you count, we've got about 1,000 loanwords from this early period. Now, when you think about this, in the earliest stages in Old English, we have a handful of loanwords from Celtic and we have a couple of hundred, 200 or 300 loanwords, maybe 600-700 at the absolute outset from Latin. So this is a huge lexical impact. And it's not only a lexical impact, we also find other structural levels of the language affected too. Now again, you can use palatalization to identify Old Norse loans. So Old Norse has words like kirkja, where English has church. So this initial k, same as in German Kirche, this k becomes a ch in Old English through palatalization, but that doesn't happen in Old Norse. And that's why there are a lot of sk sounds, for instance, in words borrowed from Norse, and those sounds help us to identify Old Norse borrowings, because Old English did not have its own words beginning in sk. They had all undergone palatalization already. Palatalization given in this box here. So we get pairs like shirt and skirt, which I think I talked about last time. We also have pairs like ship and skipper. So ship is a ship. Skipper is the captain of a ship. And this is a Scandinavian borrowing. It doesn't mean someone who skips, as in like with a skipping rope. This is someone who is in charge of a ship, or in Scandinavian, a skip. So it's a skipper. Not directly related also to Skippy the bush kangaroo. That's a different thing, right? That's a kangaroo, not the same as a ship captain. Okay, sometimes a Scandinavian word replaces the native English word. This is true for egg. So Old English has the word a bit like German I, and this gets replaced by Scandinavian egg. Similarly, Old English nieman, meaning to take, like German nehmen, gets replaced by the Norse verb taka, to take, and that is where modern English take comes from. This is a very high frequency verb. So that's the other thing about these Norse loanwords. These are not just very, very high frequency, these are not just low frequency special words for specialized situations. This is a really major scale operation that's going on here. We find very common words that are also borrowed into English from Norse. Norse can also cause meaning shifts. So in Old English, the word drem didn't mean dream, it meant joy or great happiness. And its modern meaning of a vision that you have while you're sleeping comes from its Norse cognate. Similarly, a plough, in Old English, a plough was just a measure of land. It was a quantity of land. And then it became an agricultural instrument through Scandinavian influence. So here are just a few words that are borrowed from Norse into English. Now the early loans here are in very specific domains. They're in the domains of law and seafaring because those were, and this actually again is, for these very early loans, it displays the common pattern of prestige-driven borrowing. This is the kind of borrowing that you can do because the words were useful and because the people associated with those words were prestigious. The Scandinavians had a very well-developed legal system at this point in history. That's why a lot of their words get borrowed into the Old English legal system. Also, seafaring, so skipper, for instance, harbour. We've already seen that these words get borrowed into English because essentially because they're associated with the sea, and as far as the sea is concerned, the Vikings are the ones who rule the waves at this point. Later though, and particularly from the Middle English period, we find basic vocabulary items being borrowed, and we also find unadapted, phonologically unadapted loanwords. So the early loanwords from Norse into Old English are adapted phonologically to fit the sound structure of Old English. The late loanwords are not, or at least not as much, which indicates that the type of contact changed. It changed from more of a prestige type of contact to the type of contact where you've got two communities living side by side or even intermingled with one another on relatively equal basis. So that is purely the lexical element. We also have place name evidence. Here you see the Danelaw. The Danelaw is the area that from the late 9th century onwards was subject to Danish law. This is the extent of it in roughly 1100. It's the east of the country, basically, and the Midlands and North Midlands in the east. We also have the Norwegian settlements on this side from the beginning of the 10th century. And the Norse place names that we see in the northeast, we particularly see in the counties of Leicestershire, Nottinghamshire, Lincolnshire and Yorkshire. So any place name that ends in B, that's a very clear clue that you're dealing with an area that was settled by Scandinavians because they gave their own place names to things. So rugby, for instance, which is not just a sport, but also a place where the sport was invented, with a very famous school. And rugby, this B just means dwelling or abode, some place where people live. And this B, the place names in B are found in this Danelaw area, by and large. Similarly, place names that end in Toft or Thorpe are also Danish place names. Thwaite, which you also find sometimes, which means field, is found in, is a Norwegian borrowing. It's found in the northwestern areas in particular. So if you ever go up to the Lake District up here, you'll find place names that end in Thwaite. And so that is particularly in Lancashire and in Cumbria. Old English place names, on the other hand, you can recognise because they have a bunch of distinct endings as well. So borough, like Loughborough, Ham, as in Birmingham, Nottingham, Ing, as in Woking, Reading, Stow, Stead, Hall, Witch, and Tun. These are all typically Anglo-Saxon place names. And you can use the distribution of these place names to figure out who was where and when. As far as the grammatical influence of Old Norse was concerned, the traditional view has been that the Scandinavian influence on Old English, or at least on late Old English and early Middle English, was the greatest grammatical influence that the language has ever had. And the typical example that you will see in every textbook, including the one that we're using for this course, is the example of the third person pronouns they, their, and them. Now, when you remember the Old English paradigms, which of course you've all memorized by heart by now, that was a joke, you don't have to do that. You will see that the third person pronouns are he, here, hira, and him. And these are replaced. And these are usually thought to have come from Scandinavian. But there's been a very interesting development, which is a recent article published in 2018 arguing that these pronouns did not, in fact, come from Old Norse. They actually were a native development, and they developed out of demonstrative pronouns. Since this is something, like I say, that is extremely recent research, I think the argument here is very convincing. But if so, it means that virtually every textbook in the history of the English language is going to have a little bit rewritten. And again, that goes to show that to some extent these developments, these things that I'm telling you about, these are not just dry facts that everyone agrees on. These are things that are still under debate, that are still up for discussion, things that are still being discovered about the history of the English language. What is clear is that the shift starts in the north of the country and spreads to the south of the country, which has been taken as an argument for Scandinavian influence, but it could equally well be an argument that the change started in Northumbrian Old English and then spread southwards from there. The other thing that we see in the north is that is where the endings on verbs, noun and adjectives start to simplify. So for instance, the forms ending in S, so that is the plural S, which spreads from one noun class to all of the noun classes, and the third person singular S on verbs in particular, this also spreads from the north to the south. Chaucer, interestingly, now this is something that will come up again. Chaucer is smart. Chaucer is very linguistically aware, and he knows how to represent people from different areas and different places. And when he's writing about northerners, when he's representing the speech of northerners, he uses the S ending, and when he's representing southerners or everyone else or the narrator, he uses a th, which is the inherited ending from Old English. So Chaucer's very linguistically aware, and he uses these forms. We also find the complementizer till, as in this lecture will go on till 3. That till is a till that comes from Old Norse, at least that's the standard story. Here's an example from the Peterborough Chronicle, which is the text for you to read this week. Then finally, we have at, and this is something that you probably won't be familiar with. So you'll know about the preposition at, but there is also in Old English, or in Middle English, sorry, there is a complementizer at, which comes with non-finite verbs. It's like to. So, for the common at understand means for the common people to understand. And this at is found in a northern version of the text Cursa Mundi, and it has been said to be, again, a northern feature. In certain traditional dialects of the north of England, you can also find this at infinitive marker. Though I grew up in the North Midlands of England and I've never heard anyone use it. So it's probably restricted quite heavily these days to very rural areas, very old speakers, I would suspect. And then there are many other cases. So this is only a short list of the things that could possibly have been influenced by Scandinavian. There is a whole list of other things of varying degrees of certainty. So sometimes we have to approach this as a kind of detective story. What's the strength of the evidence? How do we evaluate the arguments for and against a language contact influence? It's not always 100% straightforward to tell. Sometimes you can tell. Sometimes there are clear clues, like the absence of palatalization. Other times, the evidence has to be much more circumstantial. Okay, so to give an overview of the influences that we've seen so far, we can see that starting with the vocabulary, there is some influence from Celtic, but really not all that much. Latin, yes, there is loads of influence from Latin, not just in the period we're interested in, but also later. Norse, during the period we're interested in, even more influence. So this was in the period of before 1400, or at least in the period before 1150, the greatest influence that we see is from Norse on the vocabulary. That will change. That changes in Middle English, but we'll come to that. As far as the morphology is concerned, Celtic and Latin don't really have any morphological effects on the language. They do show lexical effects, but not morphological effects. Norse arguably does show morphological effects insofar as things like the singular S are influenced by Norse, or insofar as things like the third-person pronouns change the pronoun paradigm. So again, we can potentially, if those really are Scandinavian influences, we can see them in the morphology as well. Syntax then finally, Latin, no, Celtic and Norse, yes, although the extent is quite hard to measure. What about other languages? Now, these are not the only languages that influence the history of English. We also have words, for instance, from Dutch, from Spanish, from German, and from Arabic. Most of these are later than the Old English period, and we won't dwell on them at all in detail because these are rare, isolated words. But this slide just goes to show that English was quite keen to borrow words from left, right, and centre. It was not at all shy in this regard. So Dutch, for instance, was influential in 15th century East Anglia because of the wool trade. There was a lot of trade between the east of England and the Netherlands. So words like pickle, deck, and booze come from from Middle Dutch during this period. Spanish was just very influential in general during the late Middle Ages. So some words like cork get borrowed from Spanish into English. As for German, mostly the influence we're talking about is Low German influence from Middle Low German, from the language of the Hanseatic League. And here we get words like marzipan, again, a well-known product of Lübeck and the surrounding area. Bounce, apparently, comes from Low German, and hamster, for everyone's favorite small rodent. Arabic, there is contact with as well. There's contact through the Crusades and through merchant trade. Some of it is direct. Often loans from Arabic come through other languages like Spanish. So we get words here like admiral, saffron, and average, words from Arabic coming into English. Also words beginning in al, like alcohol and algebra. So here's an example, just to kind of wrap things up, of just how aware people were of the language situation, of just how aware people were of the kind of variation, the kind of distinct forms that were available in the language of the time. And here's Caxton. At the end of the Middle English period, we're fast forwarding a bit now, so we've got Caxton talking about northern merchants trying to buy food. And so there's a northern merchant who has come to the south and he wants something to eat, and what he wants is eggs or eggies. And the woman who is serving him says, "I'm sorry, sir, I don't speak any French." And that really annoys the guy because he doesn't speak French either. He just wants some eggs. But she doesn't understand what the word eggs means. And then someone else says, no, what this guy wants is eieren. Well, eggs, eier. And then the good wife said that she understood him. So this woman doesn't understand the word eggs, but does understand the word eieren, and the northern guy is saying eggs, which, as you remember, is a Scandinavian borrowing. So, Caxton says, what should a man in these days now write? Eggs or eieren? Certainly it is hard to please every man because of diversity and change of language. And that is no less true today than it was 500 years ago when Caxton was writing. Caxton was using it, in fact, as an argument for the early stages of standardization. He wanted to develop a unified form of English that could be used for his printing, for obvious reasons. But we're jumping way ahead of ourselves now. So we will get back to that when we talk about the transition from Middle to Early Modern English. But for now, what we've covered today wraps up the Old English period. We'll be moving on from Old English next time. So the video lecture, 2 weeks' time, will be the first part of Middle English. For now, here's the summary of what we've covered. Celtic influence, Latin influence, Norse influence. That line in here about French shouldn't be in there. I've taken that out. So we'll do French next time. Finally, then, from Middle English onwards, we start to see where the lexicon of today comes from. So we start to see the origin of the Old English, of the Modern English mixed lexicon. All these words from all these different languages start to percolate in to late Old English and early Middle English, mainly because of these three contact situations that we've covered today. Here are the textbook exercises for you to do. You've got a text from 1137, so you should already be able to see some of these changes taking place when you compare it to the Old English text you've already read. And one particular job in relation to what we've done today is to try and spot loanwords, try and spot borrowings from other languages. And I will see you in 4 weeks' time.